At issue this week, the Prime Minister is trying to sell the capital gains tax changes directly to Canadians.
This change to the capital gains tax will result in almost $20 billion in new revenue. Revenue that will go towards the biggest investment in housing in Canadian history.
But the backlash isn't coming from the Leader of the Opposition, at least for now.
There is no such increase. They pulled that out of the budget.
So how's the government selling this tax change, and is it working? Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it down on At Issue tonight. Chantal Hebert, Althia Raj, and in for Mr. Andrew Coyne, Mr. Aaron Weary. Good to see you all. Appreciate you being here. Chantal, I'm going to start with you. I think there are a couple of things on this file that moved this week. One was the Prime Minister making this well-produced video to try and explain to Canadians what this change is about. And the other we saw there from Pierre Poilievre, who remains wholly non-committal on what his position is around this piece of legislation, which I'm told, to be clear, is probably going to be tabled sometime at the beginning of June.
You would think that it's going to be tabled. And the fact that it was hived off the main budget bill kind of sends the message that they really want to have a fight on this. They've been hoping for a fight with Pierre Poilievre over this change ever since they announced it, in part because they want to frame it as kind of a class war. We're fighting for the average Canadians, and he says he is, but he's protecting so-called rich people. But I don't believe that Mr. Poilievre is going to play into and fall into a trap that is so big that you'd have to be totally blind to fall into it. There is, and the Prime Minister, I don't think the Prime Minister is trying to sell it as much as he's trying to sell what the narrative that they have been hoping for. And that would explain why it's presented separately from the budget bill, because it will force the Conservatives to vote exactly and strictly on that measure, rather than say we voted against it as part of an entire budget bill.
And also, just to be clear, that while the legislation is coming at the beginning of June, it will be implemented by the June 25th date, because there's different ways to go about doing that before the legislation is passed. But Althia, do you see either in what the Prime Minister is doing and trying to explain it, or in the way Poilievre is trying to avoiding taking a position on it, anything significant there in the two approaches?
I don't actually understand really why Mr. Poilievre is not voicing an opinion, because he knows he will have to have a vote on it. Maybe he's just trying to play both sides as long as he can. The Liberals, clearly, to Chantal's point, are hoping that they can trap Mr. Poilievre and show him. I mean, every party has the same polling. This is incredibly popular. Taxing the rich is popular, and not that many people are affected by this change, and it's the very, very wealthy who are affected by this change. And I think the Liberals have learned a lesson from 2017. They know what the opposition is likely to look like, and they are completely ready for it. They tell us privately and publicly that they will not be backing down on this. I think they are hoping to show this frame of Mr. Poilievre as basically a hypocrite, on a few pieces, on this being like, he says he's for working people and he's concerned about affordability, but when we look at taxing the wealthy, he's unwilling to do that. On the union bills, for example, he says he's willing to vote for this bill, but his track record shows otherwise, that when he was in the Harper government, he supported legislation that were anti-labor. So I think they're trying to create a frame around him. I don't know if that is actually going to work. Obviously, the voters will decide. Yeah. But it is, it's an interesting strategy, and to Chantal's point, I think it's a little desperate and transparent in the way they've gone about it.
Well, I wonder, just Chantal, go ahead, yeah.
No, I was just agreeing. I have to say I'm uncomfortable with the notion that it's now come to this, that we have tax changes without details that are basically a play and a strategy to trap the official opposition leader. It kind of makes you wonder, are we facing a government and an official opposition, or just people who are on the campaign trail using governance to be campaigning?
Though I was going to say, is it the political tactic here that is important, or is it more important, Aaron, do you think, the message that the government's trying to send, which is about tax fairness and using this money that they get, that $20 billion the Prime Minister mentioned, to try and help young people? Or are they both, equally important to the government in different ways, I wonder?
Yeah, I think they're both important parts of what could be a real debate, but I just don't think that debate is happening. Not that as has been mentioned, not despite the Liberals' best efforts. I mean, if you go back to the budget speech, Chrystia Freeland, I think, point blank said, "I'm sure people will be angry about this," and then almost, hold for anger, and it just hasn't come. And I think, part of that is that the official opposition, the Conservatives, haven't jumped on this. Now, I think that is the Conservatives trying not to get into a debate that the Liberals are comfortable having. I also think, Pierre Poilievre is waiting for, interest groups, companies, business groups to lead this fight. If you go back to that op-ed he ran in the National Post that got a lot of attention for the sort of dismissive tone towards lobbyists, within that was basically a message that if you don't like the capital gains tax changes, then go to the people and make your case and, drum up anger and opposition. And I just don't think that has come yet.
Yeah.
The Liberals, to, I guess, their credit, are taking a different approach than they took in 2017, where they, released a white paper and then put their feet up and waited for the thoughtful comments to come in. This time they're much more ready to actually discuss what they want to do. It's just that there isn't much of a debate coming back at them at this point. And until that happens, I just don't know that there's going to be one.
There are people who have expressed anger and frustration. I mean, I've talked to them on my show. That some of the tech entrepreneurs, doctors have been frustrated, but it is not like an uprising, I think, the way that we saw in 2017. Chantal, and then Althia.
But if you're Pierre Poilievre and you've been saying, "I'm fighting for the little guy, the union guy, the blue collar worker," do you really want to be standing next to a doctor and someone who works in high tech and has a good living,
Sure.
Arguing against this tax? No, you don't,
No.
because it destroys your brand. I don't believe that there is a need for the Conservative to sacrifice an ounce of that brand to fight over this issue.
Althia.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's one thing, though, I'm not sure that this is necessarily bad policy. Like, to Chantal's point, I think there were several options in front of them. One of them was like an actual wealth tax on people that made more than $400,000 a year, and they decided not to go that route. This is much more narrow and focused, and I do think, in a way, the Liberals are winning in a way that they haven't been winning for months, because we are talking about the issue that they want us to be talking about. And so they have been able to wrestle kind of the runway that Mr. Poilievre had for months, driving the narrative, in the sense that now we are discussing and he's being forced to respond to something the Liberals have put in the window.
Aaron, last point to you.
Yeah, I think the Liberals, if there is a debate here, are potentially vulnerable on a couple spots. One is the idea that this will only impact the rich. If you watch that video the Prime Minister put out, he says the rich, probably 30 times. I think there are some people who may be impacted by these changes that don't consider themselves rich, and I think that might be a potential issue. The other issue is this argument that it will be bad for the economy, bad for productivity, bad for the tech sector, but I still think that is being had, that discussion. The arguments that are coming back at the government are still very kind of vague and broad, and nobody's really putting some specifics on the table. And so, the Liberals may be looking for a fight, but they may actually find out they're winning this one pretty easily, if only because the opposition to it just doesn't seem to quite have its act together at this point.
At issue, cutting the carbon tax. In the latest attempt to axe the tax, Conservatives are proposing a summer gas tax exemption to help Canadians struggling with high costs.
An end to gas and diesel taxes from Victoria Day till Labor Day to give Canadians a summer break.
The response from the Prime Minister:
He would rather watch the country burn and Canadians suffer than continue to fight against climate change.
So is the Conservative leader's proposal a real thing? And what do we make of the Prime Minister's response? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Althia, and Aaron in for Andrew Coyne. Althia, why don't you start us off on this? I think this is probably dead on arrival because the carbon tax is caught up in it, and it seems like this is also something that provinces could do, with the exception of the carbon tax. But tell me why you think Pierre Poilievre's doing it and what you made of the Prime Minister's response.
Well, in the same way that the Liberals want us to talk about capital gains and taxing the rich, Mr. Poilievre wants us to keep talking about axing the tax, or axing taxes, as the case may be. It's a new lipstick on basically the same poster, and it's working, right? Because again, we are talking about it. Is it likely to happen? No, but it does put a bit of an asterisk on this idea. Is this something that we would find in a Conservative platform, for example? And then what would that mean? What would the fallout of not having those revenues mean for municipal infrastructure funding or, other areas where that money goes? Sure. I think what was notable for me, and you played that clip from the Prime Minister, was both the level of rhetoric from the opposition leader and the Prime Minister on this. I mean, Mr. Poilievre in his press conference came out and said really ridiculous things about the Prime Minister, how he wanted workers out of a job, and the Prime Minister counted with heated rhetoric in the same space as we saw. Like, I don't know how long we're going to sustain this if the campaign's only in October 2025, because it seems like they're itching to go at it right now. Yeah.
Chantal,
yes,
yeah,
they're itching to go at it by saying things that are, in the case of the Prime Minister today, outlandish, as in watching Canada burn rather than have a carbon tax. Well, there is a link between one and the other, but it's not the link that he's making.
Well, it was even worse than that. He said, watch the country burn and Canadians suffer. That's what the Conservative leader apparently wants to see.
I read the transcript from that news conference. It wasn't just on carbon pricing and watching the country burn. He found a way, Justin Trudeau, to go to abortion rights and Roe v. Wade coming to this country. I'm not sure he can keep up that pitch and sound reasonable. As for Mr. Poilievre's proposal, yes, it is dead on arrival, but it is a way to keep the conversation going.
Yeah.
Until April 1st, when the carbon tax was supposed to go up, that was the narrative. April 1st is behind us, and the carbon tax is still where it was supposed to be. So that is a new narrative that takes him to Labor Day with something to say about something that he, one, will not get, and two, doesn't really want to get.
I take your point about what the Prime Minister said, but I would also make the point that Pierre Poilievre was making these comments in British Columbia, a province that is dealing with forest fires, and whether or not carbon pricing solves climate change.
Yes, but it doesn't stop a single forest fire. Let's be serious.
No.
I'm a climate person.
Right.
I try to be serious about it.
Yeah.
So how much you pay for gas is not going to make an inch of difference to a forest fire in BC today, tomorrow, or next month.
Sure, but he also didn't talk about the forest fires at that press conference, which I found maybe a little remarkable. Aaron, you weigh in, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Mr. Poilievre is seriously concerned about affordability, then cutting the gas tax is actually a better idea than cutting the carbon tax, which has a rebate. The gas tax does not have a rebate. Of course, the reason that he's maybe focused on the carbon tax and not on the gas tax is because the gas tax provides revenue that can then be sent to cities and provinces for infrastructure. But in terms of affordability, the gas tax cut makes a lot more sense. As for the rest of his argument, I mean, his central argument was that the government should do these things because Canadians want to be able to go to summer vacations, and he talked wistfully about going camping in British Columbia. And I dare say that the biggest threat to people going camping in British Columbia and other places this summer is not the carbon tax, it's the wildfires. And yes, we can argue about whether or not carbon taxes on their own are going to solve the climate crisis, but we are kind of getting into I think a weird place if the leader of the opposition, the Conservative Party, is sort of loath or hesitant to discuss the fact that wildfires are going on because of the climate conversation. And again, I'm repeating myself now probably ad nauseum, but we're about to go into another summer where there are wildfires all over Canada, and we're not having a serious debate about climate policy. And because we're not having a serious debate about climate policy, we're not going to have a serious discussion about adaptation and how to deal with wildfires. And so, yes, the Prime Minister's comments, he overreached rhetorically. But there is something to be said for the fact that, if you're in BC and you're talking about going camping, how does that square with the fact that, parts of the province are on fire at the moment?
Chantal,
Yeah, but I don't-
Chantal Althia, yeah.
I don't think we've had a serious conversation about climate policy for a long, long time.
Yeah, I think we would all
and
agree
so
with that. Yeah.
I am not going to hold my breath for it to happen this summer. But I also think that the danger of the Prime Minister going over the top with this rhetoric is that it becomes, the expression in French is tout ce qui est exagéré devient futile, or something like that. If you exaggerate, in the end, you're not even in the conversation. And when I watched what I watched today, I find that the Liberals are joining the Conservatives and bailing out of the serious conversation.
Althia.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I don't think this was a message that was necessarily directed at British Columbia. Mr. Poilievre has been on the campaign trail, whether or not we want to describe it as a permanent campaign, for 2 years now. He started off his press conference with like 8 minutes or something of French. He is mostly talking to people who use their cars, whether or not they're Albertans going to British Columbia to camp for the summer. He's talking about people who live in the GTA, who drive into work, who spend a lot of time in their vehicles, people in more rural areas who use their cars and for whom going to the pumps every few days is a bit of a grimacing incident because you don't know how much more you'll be forced to pay. So that's who this is directed to. It's not necessarily a pitch to the specific group of people that he was meeting with or the reporters that he was talking to earlier this morning.
Aaron, last word to you.
Yeah, to Chantal's point, I think she's right. If you try to fight fire with fire, you may risk getting burned yourself, and I think the Liberals have to be careful in that respect. On the flip side of it is, it will be another frustrating summer if we continue to just be unable to have a conversation about climate policy and what we're going to do about it. I just don't know that ages well, and I don't know that looks like a parliament that is in touch with what's actually going on in the country. If wildfires are going on, but the conversation remains as stilted and sort of half-baked as it is.
Mark Carney has been giving more and more public speeches. The former Bank of Canada head has been a rumored replacement for Justin Trudeau, and his speeches are increasingly political.
When politicians claim our great democracies are broken, it's not because they want to fix them. It's because they want a license to demolish.
So is Mark Carney preparing to finally enter politics? Does he want Justin Trudeau's job? Let's bring in our panelists, Chantal, Althia, and Aaron Wherry sitting in for Andrew. Aaron and I talk about this probably once a week, so I'll start with him. How much longer do you think Mr. Carney can go around and give speeches? I will say, though, as a public person and someone who's been a leader in the country on different issues, without triggering the notion that he does want to be the Prime Minister, that he wants his job, that he's organizing in some way. At what point does he have to sort of say something about what he's actually doing?
Well, I think he's triggered the speculation. I guess we're about to find out how long he can keep this going. To me, I get the impression of sort of like a bird of prey circling the scene. He's obviously wants to keep himself in the conversation. He wants to kind of lay out the broad strokes of what he'd offer or how he views things. To a certain extent, I attended the speech he gave in Ottawa. It's an interesting, he has interesting things to say. It's not quite clear what it exactly amounts to or what exactly he'd do differently, but it's not uninteresting.
Sure.
The problem is the next question of okay, so what? Does he want the Prime Minister's job? Is he only willing to actually say that or go for it if the Prime Minister steps aside? In the meantime, is he willing to run for a seat somewhere? At some point it becomes a bit, tedious, I guess, to kind of watch the birds circling. But, unless or until the Prime Minister decides to step aside, or Mark Carney's willing to actually say or do something about what he wants to do, we're kind of stuck in this pattern.
Chantal.
I don't know that he's ready to jump in politics, because there are people who will argue that he's only interested in the top job, but he does sound like someone who's ready to jump in a leadership campaign. That is not to say that I expect Mark Carney to lead a putsch from outside the Liberal caucus to get Justin Trudeau to quit. I don't think we're there, but he is laying out, and he has the freedom to do it, in the sense that, as opposed to others who might want to replace Justin Trudeau, he's not in the cabinet, he's not in the caucus, he's not in the government. He's a free agent. I do not believe that it's an accident on his agenda that he keeps showing up week after week after week in different venues. Or I think what got me going this week was this picture of Mark Carney with Emmanuel Macron, the French president. Well, if you read the caption and you know nothing, you could have believed this was the prime minister of a country meeting the president of another country. And the caption kind of suggested that. I don't believe that those are part of a haphazard scheduling enterprise. I think they are meant to put him in the window in case Justin Trudeau does decide to go. Now, there are Liberal MPs who claim to still believe that he would run in the next election if there is an Ottawa seat open for him. I don't know that. I have no confirmation of that, and it could be wishful thinking on their part.
Certainly, we've all heard the stories about seats being offered and then him not going ahead. But I think we would also all agree that the speeches are also about, just keeping his name out there in this country, because he's certainly well known in other countries, and maybe just getting some practice at talking to rooms too, Althia.
Well, I don't know of any rumors that he was recently offered a seat in Ottawa. I think we're talking about a few years ago. If he had wanted to run for a seat, there was an opportunity in St. Paul's, a Toronto riding, where he could have contested the nomination. But he chose not to do that. It does seem like he wants the big job and not necessarily a lot of time waiting for it. The Liberal Party doesn't have a sort of a membership-driven process that would lead to a leader change. Really, the only way, if he is impatient, would be to try to convince Liberal caucus members to do that push that Chantal is talking about that doesn't seem to be happening. I also wonder if he's just trying to lay the groundwork for potential challengers, and we know who they are, who might look at a Carney bid and think, well, I don't really want to run against that guy. Maybe I'll just get on his organizing team instead, and then I will have a nice sweet gig. One thing I do find particularly worth noting is that he doesn't really seem to be spending that much time in Quebec, and that is the last bastion of support for the Liberal Party at the moment. And his French, while it's passable, I don't know how he would fare in a debate where you are thinking on your feet. I think Pierre Poilievre's French is probably better than Mark Carney's French. And I think if he was really serious about wanting to be Prime Minister, he probably should be spending more time in Quebec.
Okay. Got to leave it there. Suspect we'll talk about that again, but that's a good first go at it. Thank you all very much. Aaron, thanks for being here this week, and that is At Issue for this week. I'm Rosemary Barton. Thanks so much for watching.